like to invite, of course, James de Bath to come forward as a panel moderator, and he can introduce the session for us. So this is from HUMA. James. James, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much, Shafi. Thanks for the applause as well. That was very nice. We had misplaced one of our panelists, but we found her, so thank you very much. Annie's appeared at the last moment. So I just wanted to say good morning and thank you all for coming today. I'm James de Bath, Vice President of Commercial for Healthcare UK for HUMA. And joining me today I have Geraint Lewis, who is Director of Population Health at Microsoft, and Annie Carling, who is our Head of Deployment for HUMA in the UK. So the title of our session today is the do's and don'ts of setting up virtual wards. And before we kind of move on to Geraint giving us a rundown of where that all started, I was going to call you the godfather of virtual wards because he's been around and involved with it from the very beginning. So I'll let you talk about that in just a moment. But before we get into the session, I just wanted to set the scene, and thank you, Shafi, for kind of some of the context around his experience of HUMA and working with Dan, our CEO, who's been building this up over the last 10 years. We're now at 300 humans in HUMA, working across the globe, in the UK, in the NHS, but across Europe, the Middle East, the US, and other territories across the world. But in particular, my focus and the rest of the team's focus here is on the challenges in the NHS. And NHS England set a target to achieve 25,000 additional beds across all of the integrated care systems in England by the end of 2023. And I'm going to steal a fact you told me the other day, Grant, which is it's effectively the equivalent of building 2 super new hospitals in every ICS across the country. So the potential for this is huge to reduce the number of acute bed days, stays in hospital, readmission, manage the elective care backlog, and some of the major challenges that are coming with various winter pressures and just the over demand on services. So I will now just ask. I'm going to move to a seated position now for the kind of relaxed effect. Geraint. So tell us the story of where it all began, really, and take us through that experience and sort of why we are where we are now in 2022.
Sure. So it all started actually back in, I think it was 2004, when the Department of Health decided to invest in something called a predictive risk model. So the Department of Health knew that a very small proportion of the population were responsible for a very large proportion of unplanned hospital admissions. But before they invested in this particular model, it was not possible to know with any accuracy who those people were going to be. So the Department of Health invested in this tool, and for the first time, the NHS knew which people in their population were at high risk of having an unplanned hospital admission in the next 12 months. So the question I was posed was, right, what are we going to do with this information? So for the first time ever, we knew who's going to be coming into hospital. Now, I'd spent the first half of my career as a hospital doctor, done sort of 11 years working in hospitals, and you can moan about hospitals, but there's one thing about them that actually I think we take for granted, which we shouldn't really, because I think it's a brilliant invention, and it is the hospital ward. It doesn't matter where in the world you are, from the outback of Australia to the Upper East Side of Manhattan, hospitals are organised into wards. Can I get a show of hands? Is anyone here from Liverpool? No? So Liverpool has got a beautiful new, shiny new hospital that opened a few weeks ago, the Royal Liverpool Hospital. And it is made up of, I think it's like 600 individual ensuite bedrooms. However, they've still gone and organised that hospital into wards. And if they hadn't done that, you could just try to imagine it would have just been chaotic. So the idea of a virtual ward was to say, well, let's use some of that knowledge of how to organise things within hospital and apply it out in the community. So the virtual wards literally just did that. They take the systems and staffing and daily routines of a hospital ward, but apply it out in the community. So coming back to this story of the predictive risk model, what we decided to do was to say, right, for these people who we know are at very high risk of going into hospital, rather than wait for them to come into hospital, let's take that virtual ward out to them, and that's what a virtual ward does. Since then, things sort of potted along nicely. So virtual wards, we set up 10 of them in Croydon in South London, which is where I was working, and they were picked up around the world in a few places. But they very much stayed below the radar. We won some awards for them, but they stayed below the radar right up until the pandemic. And I think really it was the pandemic that kick-started them again, and for two reasons really. One was that there was this additional pressure to try and keep people out of hospital. Because you didn't want people going into hospital and contracting COVID. So that was one spark. And then the other was the advances in technology. I still find it remarkable that 3 years ago, probably none of us in this room would have heard of Zoom or Teams. These are all new technologies that really came to the fore during the pandemic. And so that combination of things sparked this interest, this renewed interest in virtual wards. And what I think is really exciting now is the different ways in which the NHS is rapidly innovating. So there's that original model that I described that we developed in Croydon, but they're also branching out in lots of interesting new ways.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that kind of history, and that you've been there and done that and seen it through. You talked previously to me about different models of the virtual ward. So sometimes as an extension of effectively the real world ward,
yeah,
versus a virtual ward that's based out in the community, and maybe some other different models that are emerging. Would you talk to that a little bit?
Sure.
As well?
So I see virtual wards branching out in 4 different directions, if you like. So that the first way in which they're branching out is the part of the patient pathway where they slot in. So those original virtual wards that we developed were what you might call a predict and prevent virtual ward. You've got this tool that tells you this is someone high risk of going into hospital, let's take the virtual ward out to them. So that's one way. But the newer ways are a diversion virtual ward where somebody's on their way into hospital and they are diverted from hospital into a virtual ward. That could be at the point of being in the ambulance, it could be at the point of being in A&E or in the acute medical unit. So that's the second one. And then the third is at the other end of the patient pathway, where you've got early discharge virtual wards, or step-down virtual wards, as they're also known, which take people who've been in hospital for a while and discharge them earlier than would otherwise have been the case, because they can be discharged onto a virtual ward. So that's the first axis. The second axis, as you rightly said, is whether or not the virtual ward is a standalone entity or whether it is attached to a real hospital ward. And particularly for those early discharge virtual wards, where the patient's been quite well known to the hospital team, you can imagine having this extra bay of beds, if you like, of people still managed by the same team, but those patients have now gone home. The third axis is the acuity, in other words, how acutely unwell the virtual ward patients are, and there's a real spectrum there. So you've got some virtual wards that only are open during office hours, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and they're there really to optimise someone's preventive care. There's that kind of model, all the way through to virtual wards that are open 24/7. And then finally, there is the axis of specialisation. And again, there's a big spectrum. You've got some virtual wards that make a point of trying to be as inclusive as possible and will take patients with a very broad range of different clinical conditions. So that's one end of the spectrum. In the middle, you've got specialty-specific virtual wards, so maybe a cardiac virtual ward or a respiratory one. And then finally, you've got these super specialised ones. And for some reason, the East Midlands has decided to go down that route. And so they've got super specialised virtual wards, for example, that will only take patients with atrial fibrillation or only take patients with heart failure.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and I hope people kind of can see how that can be used in different use cases. But as part of this, where does technology have a role to play? How can you expand out of the hospital ward using technology to reach more people?
Yeah. So reflecting back, it's quite funny to think that when we did these virtual wards originally, literally the only technology we had was a landline phone and an Excel spreadsheet. But things have moved on quite considerably since then. And what I often get people to do is a little thought experiment. So if I can ask you to sort of close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself, God forbid, lying in a hospital bed. What's going to happen to you over the next 24 hours? So just sort of think through, there'll be the ward round, somebody might come and take your blood test, they'll definitely be measuring your temperature and your blood pressure and so on. You might go down to X-ray. So think that through, what happens to you over the course of a 24-hour period. And then the second part of the exercise is for me to say, okay, now let's try and reimagine that, but every member of staff that you met is now 20 miles away. What technology do we need in order to recreate that experience? And that sort of guides you through it. So there are some fundamental things. You're going to need connectivity. You're going to need the kind of hardware device for being admitted onto the virtual ward, the ward rounds, the board rounds. You're going to need a tool, a bit like Microsoft Teams or equivalent. Then there are different gadgets, if you like, that are able to do things that historically you'd think could not be done. So when I thought, even a few months ago about virtual wards, I was convinced that it would not be possible to do a clinical examination remotely. And then somebody shows me a wireless stethoscope. So you've got a Bluetooth-enabled stethoscope, the patient's got a camera, they can position it in the right place on their chest, and the physiotherapist or the nurse or the doctor can be listening, auscultating your chest miles away. So it is really quite remarkable. One final gadget, if you like, to mention is to do with rehabilitation. So many patients will be on a hospital ward in order to receive physiotherapy and occupational therapy. There are now these devices that can track body movements to make sure that you're doing the physiotherapy exercises correctly. They can introduce an element of gamification to make it fun for you, to keep you engaged. And so more and more things, I think, over time, that at the moment we would assume could only be done in hospital, will in the future, I believe, be deliverable remotely at home.
Okay, fantastic. And I think that plays very nicely to the theme of today, which is the future hospital. Some of those things are available in the here and now and have a benefit, and some of those things are kind of developments for the future that we'll see over the next few years to improve a lot of this. So, Annie, talking about the here and now, and should we call it the pain of setting up virtual wards, would you kind of give us your experience of, tell us a little bit about what you've done so far, your experience of those implementations, maybe start with the don'ts and then the do's as a kind of an ending part, if you're all right to do it that way round.
Sure. Well, actually, I think I'm probably going to start with the do's because I like to put a positive spin on things. So I would say number one absolute must do with setting up a virtual ward is to make sure that you have the clinical leadership in place from the outset. And that might seem really obvious, but I think sometimes with nationally driven programs, it can be something that kind of gets picked up by management, and that senior management support is really important, but there's no substitute for clinical leadership in terms of them being able to promote and mobilize and get the buy-in from the wider clinical workforce. So that's the number one thing. And if I can just be really specific about that, I think that needs to be both nursing leadership, doctors, and also at the trust level, you need someone like a chief medical officer, chief clinical information officer who's going to be able to champion the project. But you also need at the specialty level, depending on the type of virtual ward and whether it's kind of more generic or more specialist, someone who's going to get more involved in the nitty-gritty of the design and then the implementation. So that clinical leadership. Secondly, another do, I think, is do make sure that you have the workforce capacity in place to actually be to enable the virtual ward. And so thinking about who is going to be monitoring the patients remotely and who is also going to be dealing with and managing any escalations that come from the virtual ward. And that might involve needing to redesign existing roles. It might mean needing to recruit new staff or to pump prime the staffing model to put that system in place. And this is all a bit of an emerging picture, right? Like in terms of trying to work out actually what is the right staff mix, the right grades, the right number of FTEs. All depends on the clinical pathway and to some degree on how you actually decide to design that virtual ward. So it's an emerging picture, I think, on that front.
Just to jump in there a second, do you find that there in the deployments that you've done that mix is different by hospital, different by deployment? Is it?
Yes, it is. It is. And it kind of depends. Some of it depends on kind of the scale of ambition as well, and whether you're, starting off with something that's a kind of a small scale pilot or a big bang. Let's go with 5 or 6 virtual wards. So that varies as well. But I do think, just coming back to that point about actually pump priming the workforce, even if it's just for a really short period of time, whilst you gather the lessons learned and the insights about what works well in practice and what does that workforce model need to look like, I think is quite an effective way of doing it.
And I'll just come back to your first point about getting senior clinical engagement and doing lots of work with clinical engagement across the pathway. What does that look like in reality? So it's all very well kind of getting the initial interest, you kick off a project, but how do you really see that through and make those transformations happen? That's a tough question, right?
Yeah, the clinical engagement, yes. How to be best friends with clinicians. So I do think that actually having that, getting someone who is who kind of speaks the language, so having clinicians in your team who can kind of do that engagement directly. But then, as I say, it really has to be led from within the organisation, from within the acute trust, and you need someone who's then going to be able to do that across the different staff groups and continue to do it. There's really kind of no, I think, alternative to just that kind of hard graft of continuing to go out and have those conversations and understand what the concerns are from different clinical groups and to be able to address those and just build that into the design.
And do you, I mean, we talked about teams and remote working, and we're all based all over the place a lot of the time. Does that kind of clinical engagement still work by setting up Teams calls, or do you find you need to go in and have that face-to-face contact with clinical teams to get the buy-in?
I actually think that the remote working is really effective. I don't think that it's kind of a particular barrier. People are really used to it now as well. I don't think that so much is an issue. I think that there is sometimes it is really good to still, go and meet people in person and, as needed, sort of be there in a hands-on way to support, and especially as you are launching and going live with these sorts of things. Yeah.
To add on that. So back in July, the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, published a meta-analysis of virtual wards. So a meta-analysis is a study where you group together lots of high-quality randomized controlled trials. And it's very exciting because it showed that virtual wards led to fewer hospital admissions, fewer A&E attendances, lower overall costs, and lower mortality. One of the things that study seemed to show, though, was there's a particular benefit with having an initial home visit with the patient. So although most of this can be done at home, there is something important about having at least one home visit at the beginning of the patient's virtual ward stay.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on that. What's your hypothesis for why that's really important?
I suspect, it's very easy for us to assume that everybody lives in a nice, warm, dry home with their own bedroom, and they've got, they can afford to keep their heating on and so on. So I think just dispelling that myth and making sure that somebody goes in and asks the question, actually, is a virtual ward appropriate for this patient? It's critically important that the NHS designs things with the most disadvantaged in mind. And so being able to do that home visit and work out, is a virtual ward just really not appropriate here, or are there steps that the NHS could take to facilitate that stay? Also looking at the home circumstances, are there trip hazards? There's all sorts of things that you just wouldn't pick up unless you went to the patient's home on that initial visit, I think.
So Annie, back to you. Any more must-dos then?
So I guess a final must-do, and this is pertinent to digital transformation in general, not just virtual wards, but I think do make digital everybody's business and not just the job of the IT department. So really kind of instilling that culture change and putting in place leadership who understand and support digital transformation, and then follow through on that with resourcing, staff, and decision-making authority. That, I think, is the difference between actually being able to get digital transformation off the ground and then to be able to scale it up. Yeah. Okay,
great. So that moves us on perhaps nicely to the don'ts.
Yes.
This is where everybody takes notes of how not to do it.
Okay, so I think my biggest don't is don't underestimate just the time and effort that it takes to get these things up and running. I think that a lot of trusts in the last few years have had a really good first bite at the cherry in terms of experience of implementing technology-enabled virtual wards because of COVID. And so we had a really particular scenario there where we have a condition that affects not just older people, but younger people, people who don't have comorbidities and have, generally a relatively good bill of health. And so that group of patients, clinicians, might have been generally more relaxed about sending home and monitoring remotely. And then secondly, exactly as Garo mentioned before, is, we're kind of in this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic scenario where there is just a level of pressure and urgency to do things differently that we don't typically see. And thankfully, we're not in that anymore, but what that does mean is that we're not in a place where we can kind of get a virtual ward stood up within a couple of weeks. It now takes longer for kind of a multitude of reasons. So I think that really, making sure that you have in place the resources, because it does take time and effort to deliver these things, would be, so not to underestimate that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really good. And I know that you have a slide that you talk to, not here, because we don't have any slides, about deployment timelines. And you mentioned the kind of different steps that are involved in getting these projects up and running. Could you talk through the sort of the pain and the length and and how that actually works in practice?
Sure. So the core of that, I would divide up into sort of three phases. So the first one is mobilization, and that is mobilizing the project team, setting up that joint team between the technology provider and the hospital trust and any other partners that need to be involved, putting in place the right governance structures, which is so critical to making these types of projects work, and really kind of getting the whole project up and running. The second phase is what I would sort of call discovery, and that is really being very clear, understanding what your problem statement is, what's the overarching objective, mapping out the clinical pathway, understanding and working through the detail of how it's going to work, what's the operational model, and what are the operating procedures going to be around the virtual ward. And then the third bit is building the solution. So that's the kind of technical bit of, once you've understood the requirements, designing and then building that solution in order to meet those. And that whole kind of that sort of chunk of the deployment bit, I would say, can take anywhere from sort of a few weeks up to kind of maybe 2 or 3 months. It depends really on the level of engagement that you have, the scale, the number of stakeholders that you need to involve. So yeah, but it's an important process to go through.
Okay, that's lovely. And you've done a number of deployments over the years. And if somebody was out there thinking about how they were going to do their first deployment, what would you recommend? So you've done a kind of a heart failure deployment in a hospital, and you've done multi-pathway deployments across systems, and they come with their different benefits and pains. Would you kind of sum up the pros and cons of that, if you can?
Sure. So I think pros and cons of, if you're kind of focusing on one specific specialty or one specific pathway and doing it in that way. The good thing about that is that typically you've kind of got the clinical engagement from the outset, and if it's something that's sort of smaller scale, it's a smaller team, it's easier to get alignment and agreement and to get things off the ground and get it up and running. The flip side of that is that it can be a bit more challenging then to get that up to scale. The difference then of if you're looking at something where you're, and I think, again, with the kind of the national initiative around virtual wards, you've seen a number of trusts that are looking at going with a number of pathways and setting up a variety of virtual wards all in one go. I think the good thing about that is you're designing and baking in the scale from the outset. The flip side is that then the clinical engagement can be something that you really have to work a lot harder for, because it tends to be something that is, a larger scale procurement that's maybe been led by operational or management teams, and you kind of have to go back to step one with the clinical engagement on that front.
Fabulous, thank you. And so we are looking at a short-term future of there being quite a bit of funding available from NHS England, some policy drive, some models of virtual wards becoming the norm. Gaurav, this is probably more a question. Have you got a vision? Do you have a vision of what the future out of hospital might look like?
I do, but it keeps changing, I think, is the truth, as technology develops. I still think it's extraordinary. 15, 20 years ago, I remember people talking about doing telephone consultations from GPs, and you had to do special training on it, and there were articles galore about, you know, the hazards of telephone consultations. And you fast forward to 2022, and is it 85% of GP consultations, I think, are now done remotely? So, yeah, keep getting challenged. I guess a lot of it will depend on how the integrated care systems develop. Certainly the predict and prevent virtual ward is very much an element of population health management, and that is something that, you know, historically the commissioning side of the NHS would have taken the lead on, whereas these diversion virtual wards and the early discharge virtual wards traditionally would have been something that would have benefited the hospital, because it takes pressure off the inpatient bed days. As these ICSs mature and they become truly integrated, one would hope that these three things will start to blend into each other. So I'm not entirely sure how they'll be configured. What I do know is that hospital wards have had longevity. As I said at the start, there is a reason why hospitals throughout the entire world are organised into wards, because if you didn't do that, it would just be bedlam. And so I do think there will be a long-term role for this concept of the hospital ward will outlive the hospital in many ways if patients are being managed at home.
But presumably there will always be a hospital.
Definitely, yeah. If you think about why somebody's in a hospital bed, generally it's for one of four reasons. So either they're there for hands-on care, and that's the kind of thing which will never be able to be delivered remotely. But many patients are there either for rehabilitation, and we were talking earlier about the use of these cameras for certain types of rehabilitation, or they're there for monitoring, and you just need to take a walk around the show here to see how many new forms of remote monitoring there are. There are patches, there are using mobile phone cameras, there's all sorts of technology there. And then finally, patients are often admitted to hospital simply for coordination purposes. So they may need lots of different clinical opinions, or they may need lots of different tests and so on. And it's just too much of a faff to organise that out in the community. One of the beauties of a virtual ward is it allows you that coordination. You know that the patient's going to be reviewed very frequently on virtual wards. You can bring in those different clinical opinions. It's interesting, if you look at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, they've got a policy that their virtual ward patients have the same priority of access to imaging and endoscopy as an inpatient would have. So I think that's another element. There are lots of policy questions that are thrown up by virtual wards, that being a good example.
Lovely, thank you so much. Now we've got a few minutes left till the end of the session. I wanted to open it up to see if anybody had any more interesting questions than the ones I'm asking. So well, that's a lot more hands up than I thought there would be. So I'm going to come down and can I walk with the mic? Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. Let me start with Craig.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. My name's Craig Vai. I work for a company called Magnetic. We're innovation and design consultants. James will probably know the gist of the type of question I'm going to ask. I'm just interested to know from the panel, in two parts really. Firstly, how important do you feel that the patient journey, the customer journey, if you will, is to virtual hospitals? And then how do we design virtual hospitals with that in mind, bearing in mind things like there are still portions of the country that are in digital poverty, very poor access to broadband, and presumably there will be some reliance on patients to use the technology in the right way.
Yes, so yeah, you're absolutely right. I think designing with that patient journey in mind, mapping that out, understanding the steps and the needs from patients. And I do think this is it's a really good opportunity to leverage the patient and public engagement teams within hospital trusts. I've worked with a number that have really, really good teams in order to tap into patients and to the public and be able to really understand what their needs are as you are designing. And yeah, to your question about the sort of the digital access and literacy, it's not a straightforward answer, and I don't think we'll ever get to a place where we're going to have 100% of people that are going to want to engage with technology in that way. So it's really important that that you continue to have the face-to-face route and the sort of traditional routes in place at the same time, and enable access to both of them. But I think the point is that for patients that do and that can and that want to engage in that way, that it is an alternative, and in some ways a better alternative to what we currently have.
Thanks. Don't have a huge amount to add. You're probably preaching to the converted, really. I mentioned these different places in the patient pathway. So you've got the predict and prevent ones, you've got the hospital diversion, you've got the early discharge. There's one other just to mention in passing. So if you go to the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, which I mentioned earlier, it's actually the very first place I worked as a junior doctor. If you walk around the hospital, there are now posters, a bit like the kind of posters that you got at the back there, which are basically advertising virtual wards to the current inpatients. So that, in other words, they're kind of trying to poach patients off hospital wards onto the hospital's own virtual ward, which I thought is quite interesting. But yeah, in terms of the design, absolutely critical, as I mentioned before, that the NHS does this with the most disadvantaged, the most digitally illiterate in mind. And I think one of the other things about technology is as it matures, it generally gets easier to use, so I'm optimistic on that front too.
Okay, thanks. We've got another question here, and then I'll come over to you in just a second.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Tarek Hani. I'm a colorectal surgeon from Preston. Very close to Liverpool, Grant. I didn't realize you have a new hospital. So the question to Annie, please, is for clinical leadership. I just happen to know from my working in my hospital that there's a confusion between leadership and management, and doctors in management are the least likely to be creative, onward thinking. So in your experience, how many of the hospital trusts that you've worked with that you had a success with their leadership? Because the people in management are quite risk averse to go further. So this is really that question. The other one, for Grant, you mentioned that there's at least one hospital visit, one home visit at the beginning to have this contact. Our nurses were telling us during COVID that actually one of the things they miss about their work is that contact with patients. So how do we address this issue? Thanks.
Yeah, you've got 30 seconds to answer that one.
Okay, so just back to this point, I think you really need, it's the clinical leads to drive this, and for management to kind of work hand in hand, but to be supportive of it. So not just, the sort of like a sort of a senior clinical director, but also the ward nurses, the matrons, the wider clinical team, for everyone to be involved and to be designing that.
Interestingly, so on your point about do clinicians miss that patient contact. So I was listening to a seminar recently where they picked up reflections from virtual ward patients and virtual ward staff. And there were two surprising things for me on that. So from the patient's perspective, one of the things that they really valued about virtual wards was the privacy. So as clinicians, we often wrongly assume that the curtains between different beds in a hospital wards are completely soundproof. Obviously, they're not. And so that was the thing that they valued most. And for the staff, it was actually the quality of the clinical interactions, because they were saying rather than being rushed around and doing 101 different things on the ward, actually when they were working on the virtual ward and they set up a time to have that conversation with the patient, it was a higher quality time, if you like, that they were able to sort of go into much more depth in terms of the richness of the conversation than they would typically find on a hospital ward. So both of those findings I thought quite counterintuitive, but interesting. Yeah.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Have we got, can we have one more question? Okay, great.
You're very kind. Joe Steele, health tech advisor and investor. When do you believe that virtual wards will start to have a material impact on the overall macro effects in the NHS of the number of beds that need discharging, the backlogs, the workforce issues or whatever? When do we get to a sort of scale when people will really feel it?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball with a kind of specific point in time, but I do think that there's a bit of it's a journey from the outset of, at the beginning. I think a lot of clinicians, when you talk to, might feel a little bit anxious to begin with, and so there's kind of the initial sort of inclusion, exclusion criteria for the types of patients. They might be fairly risk averse with the types of patients they begin to refer at the beginning. And I think as time goes on and they get used to it and they understand how it operates and the processes, that then that confidence level grows, and then they gradually start to expand the types of patients that can go on to or can be referred to a virtual ward. And I think that this sort of progress over time is where we'll get to a tipping point when it actually starts to have a really material effect.
The only thing I'd add is that NHS England, as we heard earlier, is putting a huge amount of money into virtual wards, best part of £500 million. It's also doing lots of stuff in terms of supporting the NHS locally to implement virtual wards. But in return, what it's going to be asking for, I think, will be data. So it's going to start asking for data and to start standardising what counts as a virtual ward bed and what doesn't. And so that collection of data, that maturity in the data collection, will start to allow people to answer the kind of question that you just posed.
Okay, fantastic. That's a little bit over time. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Grant, for your time. We're over on the Humour stand on F8, which is literally just behind you, if anybody wants to come and have a chat with either of them or someone else in the team. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Nice to enjoy that.